Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on reporting on enterprise value. We will give participants 1 more minute to join because we have a lot of registrations today. Great, let's kick off. And I just saw a question from one of the participants, and a recording of this will be made available to you afterwards. So welcome to the session on reporting on enterprise value, illustrated with a prototype climate-related financial disclosure standard. This webinar is an opportunity to dig into the paper that was produced by the 5 leading integrated and sustainability reporting organizations just before Christmas of last year. If we could go to the next slide. The session will briefly introduce the speakers, and then they will take you through the context for this piece of work, looking at a comprehensive corporate reporting system and its features, then dig into the prototype itself, technical observations about how it was constructed, and then we will leave ample time for audience Q&A. Now, we have a lot of participants registered today. Many of them will be participating in this Zoom session, and for the overflow, there is a live YouTube stream running as well. As a result, we won't be able to answer every question, but we have an upvote function, which means that you can look at questions that others are asking, and really point to the questions that you think are most urgent to be addressed, and that will help us navigate those and make sure that we can address the ones that really matter to you. So please do use that upvote function, and of course do ask questions yourself directly. All of that needs to be done in the Q&A function. I'm going to now hand over to the speakers to introduce themselves and let them take you through the presentation to kick us off. So if we could go to the next slide and into the photos. Thank you.
Good day, everybody. That's CDP.
Hello, my name is Marty McBrien, and I'm the Managing Director at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board.
Eric Esplanade, Chair of the Board of Directors at GRI.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Tilley, the CEO of the International Integrated Reporting Council, the IRC.
Hello, I'm Janine Gilliatt. I'm CEO of SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board.
Great. Let's go into context and over to Marty.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I mean, what a year 2020 was for so many different reasons. But back to talking about the theme today, I've been working in sustainability for over 20 years, and I don't think I could have personally predicted a bigger shift than we saw across the last 12 to 18 months to really shape the global sustainability and corporate reporting ecosystem. From the EU to IOSCO, and on the next slide, please, to the IFRS Foundation trustees. We also saw the IBC and WEF come together and publish some metrics, all significant announcements, interventions, and progress across the year. 2020 also saw the building blocks for our collective effort we are focusing on today to accelerate from the various initiatives and alignment activity we were all undertaking bilaterally to something much more meaningful, addressing the real concerns we've all heard from stakeholders across the world. So we came together to agree a shared vision for a comprehensive reporting system, which we published in September, and I'm sure all of you have read before today's session, demonstrating a coherent and coordinated solution to sustainability reporting. But what this highlighted to us was that although each framework and standard was set to fill a gap or address a concern in the market or a specific audience or user need, many of the elements of the framework standards and the platform were in fact very, very complementary. So as a practical next step to our first report, and moving on to the next slide, we came together and there was a sort of significant amount of momentum that we saw from the comprehensive statement in the market, lots of questions. So we thought, well, what are we going to do next? So we came together and we published an illustration of how our current framework standards and platforms, along with elements set out by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, can be used together to provide a running start for the development of a global standard to enable the disclosure of sustainability matters that create or erode enterprise value. Now, before we go into more detail, I want to emphasize upfront that the paper explains that enterprise value reporting, so in other words, disclosure of how sustainability matters create or erode enterprise value, is not a replacement for sustainability reporting, which serves a broad range of stakeholders and can input to public policy design and reveals issues that may emerge as material for economic decision-making over time. The paper emphasizes consistent communication of how sustainability matters that affect drivers of enterprise value creation can be a complementary enabler of change as a company or enterprise creates a value incentive for companies and their investors to improve performance on some sustainability matters. But more specifically, in high-level terms, the paper does three things, and my colleagues will go into much more detail on this today, so I won't steal their thunder and move on as fast as I can. The first thing it does is it seeks to explain each part of the system and why it is critical and how they link to each other. It secondly looks at how the International Accounting Standards Board's conceptual framework for financial reporting is well suited to sustainability-related financial disclosure and providers of financial capital, and demonstrates that standard setting for sustainability-related financial disclosure is a natural extension of the IFRS Foundation's current role and provides insight into how such an ambition could be achieved by building on content that already exists from our collective work. And lastly, it shows how the relevant components of our frameworks and standards with TCFD could form the basis of a climate-related financial disclosure standard. And we've done this in the form of a prototype, so it could serve as a running start for any standards development that the IFRS Foundation might choose to undertake if it does broaden its scope beyond financial reporting standards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Eric Hespenheid of GRI to talk us through the comprehensive reporting system. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Marty. So this is, we'll start with the big picture, as Marty just said, in terms of what a comprehensive corporate reporting might look like. I'm not going to go into details on the couple of slides I have here. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the paper and papers that set forth, what the details are intended. My role is to emphasize the idea that it's going to take, both a comprehensive look at the impacts that organizations are having on society and the environment, as well as detail in terms of how all of these impacts are having an effect on the enterprise value of the individual entity. And so what we've used is this nestled materiality box that hopefully you're familiar with, that starts with the big picture and then filters it down into those issues that are relevant to the risks of enterprise value creation or destruction. And then ultimately, there are some that would ultimately be reflected in the financial statements themselves. And so we have attempted to illustrate this dynamic materiality with this slide and the following slide. But let me just say here that there are different audiences. I think that's one of the things that should be clear from our original paper and then emphasized in this more detailed paper on the prototype, is that there are issues that are out there that can, over time, become financially significant or material, and certainly risks to value creation over time. And so this is our way of trying to bring that concept to light. But as Marty said, there's no substitute for sustainability reporting, which is trying to reflect the impacts that organizations are having on society, as well as looking at reporting and improving the reporting, if you will, from a financial reporting perspective, on how those impacts are going to affect enterprise value. So if we go to the next slide, And this one is quite detailed. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but it is, hopefully you can get, if we can move to that slide, maybe mine, oh, there we go. There's a lot of substance to this slide, so I'm not going to try to do the disservice of trying to explain it all in the 2 minutes that I have here. But hopefully what it illustrates is this concept and how the issues that are affecting us as a society, ultimately can ripple their way into the risks to financial stability of an enterprise, as well as into the financial statements themselves. So we've tried to use an example that attempts to make it clear. I realize that there's probably going to be a lot of questions with regard to what is, what all the X's mean, but the other point that I'd like to make is that, it really tries to illustrate the point that we should be using common definitions of terms. We should hopefully even be using common metrics to the extent that we can, as we try to reflect on both sides of these issues. One on, how is the enterprise affecting society? And then how are these impacts affecting the enterprise? So that we can begin to use more common language and common understanding of the definitions, and hopefully common metrics as appropriate going forward. I think with that, I'll turn it over to Charles.
Thanks very much indeed, Eric. And I love those two slides you've just been walking through. And once again, hello, everybody. So if we can turn now to conceptual frameworks. Of course, they provide the foundation for standards that contribute to the transparency and strengthen the accountability and economic efficiency. They're at the core of both the IFRS standards as well as US GAAP. And the purpose of conceptual frameworks is to assist, and I'm sure many of you will know this, a standards board in terms of developing standards based on consistent concepts. They're there to help with preparers to develop consistent reporting practices where no standards apply. I think that's a particularly important issue. And help all parties to understand and interpret the standards. And as such, it was, I think, a natural starting point for our work. And we found that rather than needing to create an entirely separate conceptual framework for the sustainability-related financial disclosure, what instead we could do was adapt the ISB's conceptual framework for financial reporting. And so what you'll see here is that the top box shows that there are many common components between the ISB's conceptual framework and those of our group of five, and particularly CDSB, IRC, and SASB. So that as a consequence, we were able to basically look at all of these get all these common components, and as a consequence, build on that, and importantly, then unite the financial accounting and the disclosure and sustainability related financial disclosure under a common umbrella of enterprise value reporting, and that common umbrella is actually also really important in terms of the dotted line there, which you see in the terms of the two middle boxes, which demonstrates the interconnectivity between the financial accounting and disclosure and the sustainability related financial disclosures. So these two middle boxes show where there are certain components, where there are components that are unique to financial accounting and disclosures, and where adaptations are needed for sustainability related financial disclosure. And we'll expand on those particular adaptations in the following slides. But then at the bottom there, it comes back together again when we get to the presentation and disclosure itself. And of course, that's another reason why everything has to be joined up with the financial accounting standard setting. It's all one form of communication to providers of financial capital. Basically talking about what is driving the market capitalization of the company, not just the book value. And that relates back to those nested boxes that we looked at before. And so if we can then move on to the next slide. And here we're showing more detail on the disclosures, that those middle two boxes, and in particular the application of materiality. Here we're talking here about the qualitative characteristics, specifically on materiality and the relevance with respect to sustainability financial disclosures. And you'll see that what we're doing here is looking very explicitly at what sustainability financial disclosures do, which is look at the short, medium, and long-term enterprise value, and that is looking into the stretching time horizon, and as a consequence, some of those sustainability matters may only translate into financial outcomes at a much, much later time, and that is obviously a significant difference between the sustainability reporting and the financial reporting. So the boundary of sustainability related disclosures has two aspects. One is obviously the reporting entity itself, but the other is the risks and outcomes beyond that reporting entity, those that can significantly affect the reporting entity's ability to create enterprise value. And obviously an example of that would be the supply chain of a company. So moving to the final box here, and the application of relevance, sustainability related financial disclosures will in many cases be industry specific and metric based. Whereas financial accounting would, in many instances, be cross-industry topics. So for sustainability-related financial disclosures, there are cross-industry matters, but there is also a strong need for industry variation. If you really want to understand the sustainability performance relative to the enterprise value, and really understand the levers available to an entity in driving its performance. And with that, I'll hand over to Janine.
Thank you, Charles. That was very, very helpful. And I am going to dive a little bit deeper into the right-hand side of the graphic that we just saw, which are the adaptations to the IASB's conceptual framework that are necessary for sustainability related financial disclosure. And just to reiterate what Charles said, which I think is such an important concept, that as we were developing our paper, we realized we probably haven't been explicit enough about in the past, is that if you look at traditional conceptual frameworks to drive financial accounting, whether it's the IASB's or US GAAP or any country level framework, they are typically oriented around getting the financial statement right, balance sheet, income statement, footnotes, and sustainability related financial disclosure is oriented toward providing insight into drivers of enterprise value, market cap being one component of enterprise value. And that is a really, really important concept as you think about the conceptual framework for sustainability related financial disclosure. So if you think about this, one of the most challenging things about sustainability disclosure is what I call scope, which is just what do we mean by the word sustainability? And if you look at GRI, IR, and SASB, we have all tried to take a stab at that concept, very clearly structuring our standards around either dimensions of sustainability or capitals. And so GRI has 3 dimensions: economic, environmental, social. IR has 6 capitals. SASB has 5 dimensions of sustainability. If we really want to move towards making this a more coherent system that is easier for both investors and companies to use, we must start with a common architecture, and we must start with a common language. And Eric mentioned this. Language really matters, and definitions matter. So I'll give you a really good example of this. Both IR and SASB use the word human capital, but when you go into our actual definitions of human capital, some things that SASB would have in human capital, IR puts in intellectual capital. So that's just unnecessary complexity for a preparer. And one of the things we think is essential is to harmonize this top-down architecture so that we start with a common language and structure. Now, we haven't done that in this paper. That's a bit of a heavy lift for some of the reasons I just said, like terms defined differently, but this is something that we are committed to doing over time. And that would give, if we embedded that in those concepts in a conceptual framework for sustainability related financial disclosure, just gives everyone a common language, common starting point. If we go to the next slide, and this is another equally important concept. There's one element of this conversation, which is around what I call scope. What do we mean by the word sustainability? There is another part of this conversation that is about content elements, what we called in the paper content elements. And this is where IR, GRI's universal standards, and TCFD have some very similar concepts, generally oriented, and we tried to orient our whole paper around TCFD 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And that's because those concepts are very simple. They're the way many businesses organize their own functions, and they have significant traction around the globe because of TCFD. So really harmonizing these concepts of talking about governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets is another important organizing framework to give us a common language. Pietro is going to dive a little deeper into metrics and targets, but before we go there, I also want to mention scenario analysis, which isn't explicitly one of the 4 TCFD pillars, but which also was something that TCFD really brought to the table, and being very explicit around scenario analysis as a tool, particularly for strategy and risk management. And so one of the things, and we say that we've said this often as we do our group of 5 work, we don't see any reason these 4 TCFD pillars have to be confined to climate. We think this is a useful framework for thinking about the broad range of sustainability issues that can impact enterprise value. And as I mentioned, there's a big opportunity here to sync up some of the concepts in TCFD, in IR, and in GRI's universal standards. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Pietro, who's going to dive a little deeper into the TCFD 4 pillars and how we use the TCFD 4 pillars in the paper. Pietro?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janine, and thank you, Marty, Eric, and Charles for your observation. Indeed, my task is to briefly introduce the climate-related financial disclosure standard prototype. And we developed it based on the observation shared so far, together with the relevant components of our respective frameworks and standard. And of course, as Janine alluded to along with the recommendation sets by the TCFD. The prototype sets out disclosure requirements that are to be used for the purpose of providing information about climate change related financial risks and opportunities, as well as the impacts on the entity's financial performance, financial position, and the ability to create enterprise value. Janine indeed, mentioned the reference to TCFD, and I'm sure that you could identify this, very clearly on this slide. That's indeed on purpose. We wanted to build on the authority of TCFD and on the great uptake of TCFD on this topic of climate. The prototype includes disclosures regarding governance, strategy and risk management processes, quantitative targets and metrics. And of course, it includes the assessments of strategic resilience to climate-related risks based on the scenario analysis. So on this slide, on the left side, you can actually see some examples of those disclosures. But let me quickly walk through each one of those 4 elements. Let's start with governance. The objective here is to enable the primary users of the disclosed information to understand the governance processes, controls, and procedures used for managing climate-related risks and opportunities. The next one is the strategy one. And the objective of the strategy disclosures is to allow an understanding of the way in which the implications of climate-related risks and opportunities are integrated into the entity's strategy, and what are the implications for the entity's business model. The following one is the risk management, and this objective allows an understanding of how climate-related risks are identified, how they are assessed, how they're managed, and what is the risk management process that is used to do so. The last one, and particularly important for us, of course, as CDP, is metrics and targets. The objective here is to enable the primary users to understand the metrics and the targets that are used to assess and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. The use of standardized metrics, we all convene, it is essential, and this is one of the reasons why we came together. But at the same time, easing the access to this information is crucial to unlock the potential of the disclosure to inform decision-making, namely
I believe we may have lost Pietro for a moment.
Structured information enables creativity between the information filter in the structure around the grid taxonomies.
Pietro, I think if you can hear me, given sound issues I think you're having with your internet, it might make sense
be back now.
To hand over exactly for the next slide.
I think I'm back now.
You are back now. Brilliant. Thank you.
Apologies for that. So I was talking about this data in a digital and in a structured way, and CDP has offered its platform over the past 2 decades, indeed, to allow the disclosure by thousands of companies, and allow the data users to understand this information and use this information in a Swiss mode. If we can move to the next slide, I think we are on the next slide already. Let me spend a bit more time on the metrics and targets themselves. Within metrics and targets, there is the need to cover 2 elements: the cross-industry and the industry-specific disclosures. In order to achieve, the disclosure objective, an entity shall disclose both elements, both matters. In terms of cross-industry, those disclosures are relevant to all entities, regardless the industry and the business model. While on the industry-specific disclosures, on the other hand, the entities should report matters and the associated material to the enterprise value based on its business model and operations. Those are often industry specific. So if you want to understand how performance of sustainability matter relates to enterprise value, it is crucial to disclose, industry specific. So indeed, I'm handing back to Janine. This topic is very important to SASB and the Value Reporting Foundation. And please, Janine, any further remarks from your side on this very point?
Thanks, Pietro. And in case we didn't fully hear Pietro, I think I could probably say exactly what you were going to say, which is how important structured information is and quantitative metrics are to being able to aggregate information for use by both companies and investors. And I think one of the key things, and we all hear this time and time again, is frustration among users of this information about lack of comparability. And qualitative information provides very important context for decision making. Quantitative metrics are really important tools to get comparability in order to enable both companies and investors to compare performance when they're making decisions. And those comparisons are equally useful for companies and investors. So many companies use information to benchmark performance against their peers. Investors use comparable information to benchmark performance within peer groups and then make decisions about allocating capital based on relative performance. So this whole idea of how do we improve the comparability of metrics is important and ensure that those metrics are relevant to enterprise value. And as Pietro mentioned, what we laid out in the paper is the concept of cross-industry disclosures that are relevant to all entities, and then industry-specific disclosures. The benefit of the industry-specific disclosures is relevance, and that certain sustainability issues are more relevant to financial performance in certain industries. The other benefit of industry-specific disclosures is cost effectiveness, which is if you can build standards around metrics that are already widely in use within an industry to measure performance. And I often call those operational metrics. In many cases, what we're doing here is we are exposing for external use metrics that are already widely in use of internal management purposes. So you can get the benefit of cost effectiveness for companies by using industry-specific metrics that are already widely in use within an industry. So I'll just wrap this up by saying what the industry-specific metrics don't replace industry agnostic metrics, but they get you the benefit of both relevance and cost effectiveness and comparability. So with that, I think I'm wrapping up, and we just want to thank all of you for being here. And we were overwhelmed and so positive about how many of you were interested in this topic, because this paper is pretty dense and technical, and we're thrilled that you're interested. And we're very, very open for Q&A and want to hear what you'd like to know more about. So I'm going to turn it back over to Clara.
Great, thank you so much, Janine. We have some very good questions coming through on the Q&A, and thank you for showing us the ones that matter most to you. I'm going to start with a question which many have said they want to understand the answer to, which is just to note that I think there's real commendament for the collaborative effort of these organizations. And just a simple question of, is there a reason why ISO wasn't involved directly in the authorship of the paper or development of the prototype? So with these questions, I will send them to individual speakers if it's obvious that they are best addressed by one organization, or otherwise open it up to the group. So in this case, open to the group if anyone wants to respond to that.
I'll respond, Clara. I think there's potentially a very valuable and significant role for ISO around metrics design, back to this idea of or our objective of having comparable metrics wherever possible. That is very difficult to achieve on a global basis. And I think the ISO process has proven that it can deliver comparability on a global basis. So I think it's a very, very valuable contributor to all of this work we're trying to do. I think just in reality, we weren't at the point yet where we were talking about metrics design. We're really talking at this point around concepts. So there was no, explicit reason to exclude ISO. We were just, I think we're not at the stage of the process where their expertise is most useful. I think it will be most useful on metrics design.
Great. Any other comments before we go to the other questions? There are many of them.
And just to say,
Marty.
Clara, that this group of 5 does also, through the corporate reporting dialogue, regularly meet with ISO and others on this broader reporting landscape to make sure we all keep each other in the loop about what is going on and next steps and work. So they're very much engaged from that perspective on this work program.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, the next question is a broader one to all of you, which is talking about next steps. This is always a burning question on people's minds. Could the group comment on, outline next steps throughout the course of 2021, following this prototype and the feedback that you may receive on it?
Yeah, so Clara, this is Eric. I'll take a first stab at that. There are some big picture items, and there's some more, I would say, detail, but important detail. One of which is the collaboration that GRI and SASB is currently underway with an additional communication piece designed to very forcefully illustrate, how GRI standards and the GRI reporting framework interlaces with what SASB has created from an industry metrics perspective. So subject to some final review by Janine and myself and others, and we hope to publish that by the end of this month. So there's a concrete piece that says, okay, we're talking a lot about on this webinar about the future state. There is the current state, and so this collaboration between GRI and SASB is intended to help on a near term gain an understanding of how we operate and can be used collectively for disclosures of different matters. I think the longer term, and also related to SASB, is that we've had some discussions and are having discussions about, what, again, a future state of what does a joint standard setting collaboration look like to address what Janine was talking about and others of the speakers have talked about in terms of, how do we get to some common language and common definitions and even some common metrics as appropriate. And so that discussion between SASB and GRI continue. I think the bigger picture is more difficult to hone in on because of the dynamics of what's happening in the EU and what's happening with the IFRS Foundation. I think over the coming few months, not years, but few months, I am hopeful that we'll get some more clarity as to what their initiatives are doing and what their direction is, and how do we as a group of 5 and others, best fit into, that evolving landscape. So I would say it's going to be a little difficult for the 5 of us to figure that out. I think there's some other parties that need to clarify their positions and what their signals are that then we'll be prepared to step into. But that would be my response. Janine?
No, I agree completely with what Eric just said. And Charles, maybe you want to talk a little bit about our plans vis-a-vis merging SASB and IIRC into the Value Reporting Foundation, which is another major step here.
Yeah, and clearly the merger is not just about 2 organizations to coming together. It's actually what is the purpose of doing that. And a significant part is about reducing complexity, which is something that everybody's been complaining about. Another aspect is alignment, and I think that's something that you and I are very focused upon at the moment, Janine. And our intention would be to start working on that, immediately, really, this quarter, this half year. And there are some really important issues there in terms of, for instance, your 5 principles, our 6 capitals. How do we align those? And there's just a general alignment agenda. And then, what we're also focused upon is we might be the first people who actually moved in terms of merger, but we don't see ourselves just stopping. If others join us, that would be great. And we, in our press release when we launched the intent to merge, we referenced the fact that CDSB, for instance, would be interested in discussing the opportunity of joining us as well. And I think there are many others out there. So those are the issues that we're some of the issues that we're focused upon at the present time. And Janine, I'm sure you've got.
Janine, any further comments on that?
No. And Charles cut out just as he was mentioning my name.
I think he was looking for any further comment.
Thank you. But no, I think Charles put it well, and especially the idea that, this isn't about single organizations. This is about what's the best path to designing the comprehensive system, and what's the fastest path to designing the comprehensive system that we've laid out in both of these papers. So just want to give everyone involved huge credit for that, because as echoing what Marty said to open the session, I think we moved faster last year than I would have ever thought possible. So really amazing progress.
Great. And just to build on some of Eric's comments, because it fits with a question we've had that lots of people are interested in, how do you envisage working together with the question is both about the IFRS and the EU, so looking at both. Is there any more insight you want to share on that with the audience today?
Yeah, well, I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge that the IFRS just closed a consultation at the end of December, and the IFRS Foundation has a very open and transparent governance process and has to run their own process. And make sure they have buy-in from all of their stakeholders. So I do think they need to answer the 2 or 3 threshold question, or they need to analyze the responses they got to the consultation on the 2 or 3 most core threshold questions, which are, should they play a role at all? Who should the target audience be for the information if they decide to play a role? And what definition of materiality should they use? Should they use what we call in our papers the enterprise value-oriented definition of materiality, or should they really play a role around double materiality that encompasses a broader scope of information? So I think they need to analyze their consultation responses and answer those 3 threshold questions before we're clear how we collectively as a group could or should move forward with them. And they did get nearly 600 responses to the consultation. So they are busy reading the 600 responses to the consultation right now. What I would say is there's been some press that our collective efforts of the group of 5 or the Value Reporting Foundation efforts are in competition with the IFRS Foundation. And I want to reiterate really, really clearly that that is not the case. We see ourselves as a resource for the IFRS Foundation at the point in time where they're ready to engage in what we call the conversations about the how. So when they're ready to transition from should we move forward to how should we move forward, then we collectively are ready, willing, and ready to engage in them. So that's the answer vis-a-vis the IFRS.
Yeah, if
Great.
I could, Clara, from an EU perspective, because that's obviously another major player and actor in this. I think it's very similar in the sense that they are going through an additional process. There are some submissions that are going on this week to the AFRAG and others around what the EU is proposing to do. So along the same lines of what Janine just said about the IFRS Foundation, I think all of us are interested in helping from an EU perspective to meet their ambitions of designing a reporting regime, both for the financial reporting aspects of it, but also the impacts on society, this concept of double materiality that they promoted. And again, until we have some more clarity, because we're not in the room on those discussions that either IFRS Foundation trustees are having or the EU participants are having, but we are actively in discussions with them and are trying to help provide whatever we can in terms of, let's not start over. There's an awful lot of intellectual capital that has gone into all of our frameworks and standards around the table, that really need to be leveraged. We recognize how quickly the EU would like to move forward. We recognize how quickly the IFRS Foundation wants to move forward. To move forward quickly does infer, and it doesn't require it necessarily, but certainly would infer that they would be building on the great work that all of us have done over the last 10 or 20 years, depending on the organization. So.
And in fact, both of them, IFRS and EFRAG, explicitly express that desire to build on ERIC, which is brilliant to see. So this prototype, I think the phrasing used in the report is providing a running start with technical content, which is fantastic to see. Marty, did you want to comment before we go on?
I mean, I think what's really important about all of this activity is really about the bringing it together, the harmonization. But I have to stress to everyone that's listening, this isn't a reason to stop reporting to any of us for any reason. This is a reason just to be going faster and applying yourself more, because in many ways we've just made it a bit easier for you to use what you already have. And, I really encourage everyone this reporting cycle, the next reporting cycle, to do more, go further, go faster. We need to keep the momentum up, and we'll keep it up from a standards perspective, a frameworks perspective, and, we'll keep that pace up at our side. And, you've heard about some of what some of my other colleagues are working on, but, from a corporate disclosure perspective and reporting perspective, there's no time to slow down. So, please use this report to leverage off that and move forward, and you make a running start at what might be coming from the EU and the IFRS Foundation in due course.
And if I could just add that our focus ultimately is obviously meeting the needs of the market, meeting the needs of society, regulators, and so we're here to listen and make sure that in terms of addressing the speed of change that people are looking for, we're also making sure we remain relevant. And so hearing the people on this webinar, for instance, views, and making sure that we are addressing what the market needs, I think is absolutely critical. And so we're open and listening.
Fantastic. I'm now going to take a question which actually can be interpreted, I think, in two ways, and both of them are relevant. So I think for these speakers, the first way I'm going to interpret it is the question is about how would a comprehensive climate report integrate with wider ESG corporate reporting. Now, the first way I'm going to take that question is to say this prototype is about climate related financial disclosure. What is its applicability for other sustainability topics? And then I also want to look at it a different way, which I don't know how it was intended, but the other way you could look at it is what does climate reporting using a prototype like this, how does that integrate with reporting on climate more broadly to a full range of stakeholders? So I think if we could answer that question in both ways, it would be really helpful. And over to you, whoever wants to come in first.
Well, I'll start, because I think what a couple of slides very technical slides that I talked about earlier, I think is trying to make the point that there are two perspectives with regard to, how one thinks about reporting. But I would start with the premise as to why are we doing, reporting isn't the point. Reporting is intended to simply illustrate and provide some transparency as to what's happening. And so what's happening on an environmental standpoint or a societal standpoint in terms of the impact these companies are having on us as society is a critically important perspective. And a number of us, CDP, and all of us have been at this for quite some time, trying to make the point that, these are important issues. And if we as society don't take action on these as they emerge and don't take some remedial action or change their behaviors, then they're going to cascade ultimately into something that is going to be not just financially material to an individual company, but actually material to us as individuals. And to look at what's happening from a climate change standpoint, I think that illustrates the point quite dramatically, is that had society generally taken action in the 30 years ago or more, when some of these issues and some of these impacts were starting to become very evident, then perhaps we could have mitigated some of the damage that's now occurring, that is causing individual companies and individuals, to have material impacts on them. And so I think it's taking that funnel approach, if you will, or that nested materiality approach, and saying, this is real life. These are issues that have to be illustrated or illuminated in order to understand from a policy standpoint and an individual company behavior standpoint and an individual's behavior standpoint that are coming at us. And so I think this is, it makes the point quite vividly, I think, that we need both perspectives. We need to understand what are those big issues that are individually not necessarily that critical to an individual enterprise, but collectively are having a systemic risk to us all. And as those systemic risks are not addressed, it ultimately may manifest itself into the kinds of crisis that we find ourselves in, particularly with climate change. And so these disclosures are intended to do both. One, make the big point, and are there policy changes, regulatory changes that need to occur in order to change behaviors and limit activities that are harmful, at the same time providing the necessary information for investors and for providers of financial capital to play a critical role in allocating those resources to the solutions and not to exacerbate the problem.
And just
go ahead, Marty.
I'll be quick, Janine. Just to build off what Eric said, the risk strategy, governance, all those topics that we've outlined in there, and particularly explained for climate, could apply to any sustainability issue. You can get started on all of those now, and then look to some more detailed metrics via GRI, SASB, CDP, wherever needed, based on the industry or sector or across to the FIBC. You can apply them to anything. It's sort of almost the brilliant part of this. You can get started now, and it's relatively straightforward. Janine.
Yeah, and I was going to say a version of that, Marty, to really answer the part of Clara's question about how does climate reporting relate to reporting on other sustainability issues. If you think of this through the lens of enterprise value, no single factor ultimately drives a company's market value. It is the interrelationship between the management of multiple factors. And so a company could have outstanding environmental performance, but have a very weak human relations or labor relations record, or could have labor relations issues. It could have weak aspects of its corporate governance. And so if you're trying to think about this through the lens of what drives enterprise value, it's how effectively all of those factors are being managed. And as Marty said, the place where all of those factors come together is through a company's strategy, through a company's risk management, through the targets they set and the metrics that a company tracks. And so really bringing all of those sustainability issues under the architecture of governance, strategy, and risk management is a very helpful way, I think, to think about this and communicate it.
Great, thank you. And actually, as someone in the chat pointed out, it's always nice when participants show they've read the material. Someone quite rightly said, do look at the presentation standard in the paper. It isn't just a prototype of a climate-related financial disclosure standard. That's preceded by a generic presentation standard to make the point that Marty made, to show the applicability of this for all issues. So there's another question, and I think, Eric, this speaks to some of what you were saying. I just want to make sure we give it the time it deserves. But many people are interested in, I think, how can we ensure that corporate reporting will contribute to true transformation that we need? And that's coming from the perspective of the whole system. So sustainability as defined by the SDGs, for which we need both the sustainable development perspective and enterprise value lens on that. Eric, what is it that we can do to make sure that the reporting fulfills its ambition to drive change? Are there other factors that you think are very important?
Well, there are, and it probably, it would be a bit controversial, I suspect, in some circles, and that is that, we really are past the point where we can solely rely on the willingness of a volunteer group of companies to make disclosures that are important, both for enterprise value creation, but also very importantly, in terms of their impact on society and their contributions or lack of contributions to the attainment of sustainable development goals. And so I think, one of the important elements here is that we do need to mandate more disclosure so that we get a full picture of what's actually happening to our society and the planet. And that's something that we have not arrived at lightly, recognizing the hurdles and the challenges of trying to make something mandated, particularly when it's still a bit of evolution in terms of, the need for common definitions, the common metrics, all the things that would drive that comparability and comparison and usefulness in terms of the information that it's illuminating going forward. But I do think that, I think we're on a path here that says, we can't just rely on those willing to do it. We need to actually ask people and organizations to provide the information so we can get a much clearer picture and a more complete picture as to what's happening, so that we can be informed in terms of smart regulation and for the information of policymakers, to drive the societal changes that we need to achieve the SDGs.
Yeah, true.
If I may here, I absolutely agree with Eric's point. We do need, push by policy to make, disclosure mainstream, and this happens through mandatory disclosure. But another key element that is very close to our chest at CDP is the use of the data disclosed by the company. Because the use of the data allows those things that would ultimately align capital allocation, for example, towards the Paris Agreement goals, towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And we can enable the use of this data if we allow a structured repository of this data, if we allow ultimate users to have easily accessible access to the information, to be able to manage in a more easy way. And therefore the needs of taxonomy is crucial. The need of structure and digitized data is critical.
Great. Any final comments from others on that question of what else we need for reporting to fulfill its potential?
Well, I think, Clara, we're wanting to move to a situation which we've achieved over decades with financial reporting, that we have a system which has reliable and complete information. It has connectivity and comparability, and that used to represent most of what the value that was provided by companies, and it no longer is the case. Now the vast majority of value doesn't sit on the balance sheet of companies, so we need to expand the system, and that's what we're trying to do, so that we have a comprehensive set of standards that actually support comprehensive reporting. That's the overall objective of our ambitions.
Fantastic. Well, we are approaching the hour. There have been some really good questions in the Q&A, and I apologize to everyone. We don't have the time to go through them all today, but I know that the 5 participants in this paper called on everyone, all actors in the ecosystem, to engage with them to make progress on this shared vision of comprehensive corporate reporting. So I'm pleased that this webinar is an example of how that engagement can happen, and I hope there is lots more of it in the year ahead. Thank you so much to all the speakers today, and I wish you all a good week.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all.
Thank you.